In the murk of the dusty wagon saloon, where the air was thick with spilled whiskey, sweat, and the quiet desperation of men who had nothing left to lose, a man's worth was determined by the hand he played. Lamplight, yellowed and weak, clung to the haze of smoke that curled toward the ceiling, turning the room into a place of shadows and tension. At the center table sat Cole Thorne, a rancher whose silence spoke louder than any man's boast. His rough hands, scarred from years of working the land, held his cards with the precision of a man who had learned to hide his thoughts. Across from him sat Jack Silas, sweat slicking his forehead, his eyes flicking nervously between his shrinking pile of coins and Cole's unreadable face. The last hand was coming, and Silas was already a dead man walking. His horse was gone, his land gone, and now he had only one thing left to wager. His voice cracked as he shoved a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper onto the pile of coins. "A girl," he rasped, "from the east. She's a slave, but she'll make a fine wife." The room went dead silent. In the far corner of the saloon, hidden in the shadows near the back door, sat Maylin. She was an echo in this world of loud men, a ghost waiting to be noticed. Her gaze was locked on the table, her dark eyes wide with terror, as if she could already feel the weight of the bargain being made. Cole's eyes flicked toward her, catching the shimmer of fear in her eyes. He exhaled, his jaw tightening. The weight of his past pressed against him like a stone, and something shifted inside him. He wasn't a man who thought a soul could be owned, but for a moment he could see beyond the transaction. With Silas, she was nothing more than a commodity. With him, she might find freedom. "Call," Cole said, his voice flat, the decision final. He laid his cards on the table. A flush, king high. The room stilled, the tension like a storm before the rain. Silas's face contorted with rage, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he stormed out, leaving the smell of defeat behind him. The money was his, but Cole's eyes were on Maylin now. Her fear was a palpable thing, and for the first time in his life it felt like a debt he had to pay. He didn't speak as he gathered the coins. His mind was already on the journey ahead, but his heart was already with the girl in the corner. The ride from the saloon to his ranch was a long, quiet one. The creaking of the wagon wheels was the only sound, a steady rhythm against the vast emptiness of the prairie. Cole sat at the reins, his posture stiff as he stared into the distance, the wide sky above him a constant reminder of the isolation he had chosen. Maylin sat in the back, wrapped in a rough blanket, her small form barely visible beneath it. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Her world had just shifted from one cage to another. The sky darkened as the sun began its descent, painting the world in shades of purple and orange. The landscape stretched on forever, a barren sea of sagebrush and dirt. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was heavy, with something unspoken. When Cole stopped the wagon by a dry creek, he didn't look at her. He climbed down, filled his canteen, and set it by the tailgate, along with some dried meat and bread. He didn't offer it to her. He simply placed it down and turned to tend to the horses, his back to her. It was an hour before Maylin moved, her hand shaking as she reached for the canteen. Fear was a luxury. Survival was her only instinct now. The water was cold, and the bread wasn't stale. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world where kindness was a rare thing, it mattered more than she could say. The ranch was a place of quiet purpose. The house and barn stood like sentinels against the darkening sky, solid and unyielding. It wasn't a grand place, but it was steady. The fence around the land was high and well kept, a sign of the man who lived here. As Cole pulled the wagon up to the smaller cabin, the last of the daylight slipping away behind him, he turned to Maylin. "This is yours," he said, his voice low and rough. He pointed to the cabin, his expression unreadable in the dimming light. "There's food, water, a lock on the door if you need it." He didn't wait for a response. Without another word, he walked toward the barn, his back already turned. Maylin stood there for a long moment, the weight of the night pressing in on her. She was alone now, but there was a strange feeling in her chest, a fluttering, unsure sensation she couldn't quite place. The cabin was small but clean. The warmth from a fire crackled in the hearth, and the small room smelled faintly of wood and fresh bread. It was a stark contrast to the darkness she had just left behind. There was a cot in the corner, neatly made with a thick quilt. On the table was a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, and a tin cup of water. For a moment, she thought about leaving, about walking out into the night and letting the cold swallow her whole. But the door locked behind her with a solid click, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of it. The next morning, Cole was gone before dawn, his movements quiet and purposeful. Mei Lin awoke to find a pail of fresh milk and a basket of eggs waiting outside her door. She didn't understand why he did it. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke to something deeper, something she couldn't grasp yet. Days passed, and the rhythm of life on the ranch began to settle into something routine, though Mei Lin's heart was still in turmoil. She observed Cole from her window, watching the way he worked the land with a quiet intensity. He spoke more to his horse than to her, his words low and gentle. There was something about him, something that pulled at the edges of her fear. Each night as she lay in her bed, she thought about what it meant to be free, what it meant to live outside the bars of a cage. But there was no answer. Not yet. The days on the ranch bled together, a quiet march of sunrises and sunsets, broken only by the sound of boots on dry earth and the occasional flicker of conversation. Cole's world, a universe of chores and silence, now had a quiet presence woven into its fabric, a presence he had never planned for. Mei Lin had become a part of the rhythm, even if she didn't yet understand her place in it. Morning started before the sun crested the horizon. Cole was already gone by the time the first light broke across the sky, his heavy boots stirring the dust as he worked with a relentless determination. Mei Lin, however, had started to rise with him. The darkness outside the cabin was no longer a threatening presence. It was simply the backdrop to her new life, a life where each moment held the quiet promise of survival. It was during the mid-morning when she first ventured beyond the cabin with a basket in hand, the familiar heat of the sun already settling on her skin. She'd watched Cole from the window enough times to know where he was likely to be. She found him at the far end of the ranch near the small herd of cattle, his broad back hunched as he worked, mending the torn fencing that bordered the land. The sight of him, focused and unyielding, stirred something within her, something unfamiliar, something softer. She didn't speak. She didn't know what she could say, or if she even wanted to. Instead, she quietly observed him as he worked. Her hands trembled as she held the basket of herbs she had gathered, a small offering to break the silence between them. She set it on the ground, a few feet from where he was kneeling to repair the fence, and then took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Cole glanced up briefly, his eyes flicking over her with the same quiet assessment he'd given her the day they met. He didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge the herbs she had brought, but there was a shift in his gaze, a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of understanding. Mei Lin stood there, frozen in place, waiting for something, but unsure what that something might be. When Cole went back to his work, the air between them didn't feel as thick. The silence, while still there, had softened just a little. Days continued to follow this same pattern. Mei Lin kept to herself mostly, learning the layout of the ranch and trying to find her place. She spent long hours in the cabin, tending to the small garden she had begun behind the house, her fingers becoming familiar with the soil once more. It was the first thing she had done since coming here that felt like her own. Each small seed she planted was a promise to herself, a declaration of the life she was trying to rebuild, one quiet act at a time. But it wasn't just the work that had begun to shape her new life. It was the quiet moments, when Cole came to the cabin with a piece of fresh meat, or when he left a new basket of eggs on the porch. Each gesture, while small, had begun to break down the walls she had built around herself. She could feel it, a change that happened slowly, like the coming of dawn, too gradual to notice at first. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Cole sat on the porch of his house, whittling a piece of wood into a shape he had yet to determine. Mei Lin watched him from her window, her eyes following the slow, rhythmic movements of his hands. She had never seen him smile, never heard him speak anything other than the barest of words. But there was something in the way he held the wood, in the way his fingers shaped the soft grain, that made her feel something she had never thought possible. She rose from her seat, the wooden floor creaking under her feet. Slowly, as if the weight of each step was measured, she walked to the door of the cabin. The air was still warm from the fading sunlight, but the evening chill was beginning to settle in. She stepped outside and, with a hesitant breath, made her way toward him. Cole didn't notice her at first. His focus was entirely on the wood in his hands, the small knife he used to carve it, his movements steady and deliberate. It wasn't until she stood a few feet away that he looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as if unsure of what he was seeing. She didn't speak at first, not knowing what to say. Instead, she sat down beside him on the porch, her presence an unspoken request for some kind of connection. For a long while they sat in silence. The only sound was the occasional scrape of Cole's knife against the wood and the soft rustle of wind in the trees. Maylin could feel the weight of the night pressing against her, but for some reason, in this moment, she didn't feel the need to run. She didn't feel the need to hide. Cole's voice broke the silence, quiet and rough. "You've been working the garden," he said, not looking at her, his eyes still on his carving. "It's good work." Maylin nodded, unsure of how to respond. She didn't have words to explain what she had been doing, why it had felt so important. But his recognition of her effort, small as it was, mattered more than she realized. He turned the piece of wood over in his hands and studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You've got a good hand," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wouldn't mind teaching you more about how to carve." It was a simple offer, but it carried weight. Maylin felt the shock of it, the unexpectedness of it. The offer of knowledge, of something beyond survival, felt like the first kindness she had been shown since this journey began. For a moment, she didn't know what to do with it. "Maybe," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. As the night stretched on and the stars began to blink into the black sky, the quiet between them grew less oppressive. Maylin didn't yet understand what it meant, this small gesture, this simple conversation. But for the first time since she had been brought to the ranch, she felt like she might, just might, be able to stay. The rhythm of life at the ranch had settled into something steady. The heat of summer, though still present, had softened at the edges. Mornings were cooler now, and the sun set a little earlier each day, casting longer shadows across the land. Maylin had grown accustomed to the routine, to the quiet hum of the world she was slowly starting to belong to. But she was still not sure where she fit. Each morning she rose early, before the first light broke over the horizon, her feet moving quietly on the wooden floors of the cabin. She found peace in the small tasks she had begun to claim for herself. Tending to her garden, cleaning the cabin, mending clothes. Her hands were growing calloused from the work, but there was a satisfaction in it that she had never known before. For the first time in years, she had control over something, small though it was. She wasn't simply a thing to be owned. She was a person who could shape her own world, bit by bit. Cole, too, had settled into a silent rhythm. His days were filled with the same relentless work, mending fences, tending to his cattle, repairing the roof of his cabin. But he always had a few quiet moments in the evening. They rarely spoke, but Maylin had begun to notice the subtle shifts in his presence, the way he would pause just before leaving for his evening chores, his eyes catching hers for a split second before he disappeared into the dusk. It was a wordless connection, one that neither of them had yet to name, but it was there, in the space between them. One evening, as Maylin finished collecting herbs in the fading light, she heard the familiar sound of Cole's boots crunching against the dirt path. He was coming from the barn, his movements slow but deliberate. As he reached the porch, she looked up from her work, wiping the sweat from her brow. He was carrying something, a bundle wrapped in a rough cloth. He set it down on the porch with a quiet thud. "For the garden," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Got some seeds from town. Thought they might do better here." Maylin's eyes widened. She hadn't expected him to do something like this. It wasn't the first time he had brought something to help her. Water, food, the occasional tool. But this felt different. It wasn't just about survival. It was a small act of kindness, one that spoke to something deeper between them. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, her heart swelling with something she couldn't yet understand. The gesture felt like an invitation to something more, something that went beyond the isolation they had both lived in for so long. She reached out to touch the cloth, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric, and for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a barrier. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice small but genuine. Cole gave her a slight nod, then turned to leave, as if the moment had passed. Maylin stood there for a moment, watching him go, and in that fleeting silence, something inside her shifted. The next few weeks passed in a haze of activity, as the work on the ranch grew more pressing with the changing season. Cole's quiet presence had become a part of Maylin's days, and she found herself looking for the small, familiar signs of him, the way he would appear at the porch with a fresh basket of eggs, or how he would pause by the garden to check on the plants she'd started. One afternoon, as the heat of midday pressed down on the land, Maylin found herself in the small barn sorting through the hay. The air inside was thick with dust, the smell of animals and old wood. She had just finished when she heard the sound of boots approaching. She straightened up, brushing the sweat from her brow, and looked toward the entrance. Cole stood there, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face impassive as usual. "Got a leak in the roof of the main house," he said, his tone flat. "Could use a hand." Quote. She nodded, unsure of what was expected of her but willing to follow. Maylin had seen him mend roofs before, knew he preferred to work alone, and yet there was something in his eyes now that made her think this was more than just a simple chore. They made their way to the main house, the sun still high in the sky but beginning its slow descent behind the hills. Maylin followed him up the ladder to the roof, her hands gripping the wooden rungs as she climbed, unsure of her footing. When they reached the top, she stood beside him looking out at the ranch below. It was a view she had seen countless times now, but it felt different from up here. The vastness of the land stretched before her, the rolling hills and the distant mountains like a world she would never fully understand. She felt small in this world, and yet, for the first time, she didn't feel like an intruder. Cole was already at work, his hands moving quickly and efficiently as he patched the leak in the roof. Maylin stood silently beside him, watching the way he worked. The way his movements were precise, almost mechanical. He didn't speak as he worked, but there was a quiet energy to him that Maylin couldn't help but admire. When the job was done, Cole stood up and wiped his hands on his pants, looking over the roof one last time. "That should hold until the next storm," he said, his voice low but steady. Maylin nodded, unsure if she should say something more. She wanted to ask about him, about his life before the ranch, but the words wouldn't come. They climbed down the ladder, and as they reached the ground, Cole turned to her. "You've done well here," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Better than I thought you would." The words were simple, but they hit her harder than anything he had said before. She wasn't sure why they mattered so much, but they did. They meant something, something that she couldn't yet put into words. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded and then turned, heading toward the barn without another word. Maylin stood there for a moment, her heart racing. She had no idea what was happening between them. This unspoken connection, this slow-growing understanding. But she knew it was something she hadn't expected. She had come here as nothing, a thing to be owned, to be used. But now, she was something more. And, for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just surviving. She was living. The coolness of autumn settled over the ranch like a gentle hand, softening the earth and bringing a stillness to the air. The days were shorter now, and the winds had a bite to them that hinted at the coming winter. But for Maylin, the changing season didn't feel like an omen of hardship. It felt like a new beginning. The work on the ranch continued, but the steady rhythm of chores, of small gestures, had created something between Cole and Maylin, a bond that neither could fully name, but both could feel. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something deeper than the silence that had once defined their lives. The land they shared was vast, but their connection, though subtle, was growing. Each morning, Maylin would go to the garden before the sun was up, tending to the plants with a quiet care. Her fingers were no longer trembling with fear when she worked. They were steady and sure, the same way Cole's had been when he fixed the roof or worked with the cattle. She felt the earth beneath her fingertips as something familiar now, something that belonged to her just as much as it belonged to the ranch itself. The mornings were still solitary, but they were no longer lonely. She would catch glimpses of Cole as he moved through the work on the ranch, his presence always somewhere in the background. He had stopped leaving without a word, and his eyes would sometimes meet hers from across the yard, just a flicker, a brief recognition of their shared existence. She had begun to understand the language of his silences, the way he would nod once in her direction when he brought food to her cabin, the way he would pause in the middle of a chore to look at the sky, his mind far away but his body present. One morning, as the pale light of dawn began to stretch over the land, Maylin found herself standing at the edge of the small creek that ran behind the cabin. The water was low this time of year, but it still held a quiet beauty. She knelt down and dipped her hands into the cool stream, feeling the water rush over her fingers, washing away the dust of the day's work. It was a simple act, but it reminded her of the small moments of peace she had come to cherish. As she rose, a sound from behind her made her turn. Cole was standing at the edge of the creek, his silhouette framed by the pale light of morning. He was holding a leather pouch in his hand, something small and familiar. Maylin's heart quickened, though she didn't know why. "You're good with the garden," Cole said, his voice steady, his eyes unreadable. "I thought you might want something else to grow." He opened the pouch and tipped it into his hand, revealing a handful of seeds, new ones she hadn't seen before. "These are from the highlands. I don't know if they'll grow here, but I figured we could try." Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at the seeds, her mind racing. It wasn't just about the plants, it was about the trust he was giving her. These seeds were a gift, a symbol of something more. Maylin took the pouch, her fingers brushing against his. The touch was brief, but it sent a ripple through her, a shock of something she couldn't yet name. She met his gaze, her eyes steady, and for the first time in a long while she spoke freely. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, clear. "I'll take care of them." Cole nodded and turned, walking away without another word, his back straight, his face as impassive as ever. But Maylin knew something had shifted between them. She could feel it in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun rising above the land. The days passed in a quiet blur. The chores continued, but now there was a sense of rhythm to them, a balance between the work and the silence they shared. Maylin had begun to leave small tokens for Cole, carved wooden figures she made during her spare moments. The figures were simple, but each one held meaning: an owl, a horse, a flower. She left them on the porch near the barn, places where he would see them but not ask questions. They were her way of saying thank you, of acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. And Cole, in turn, began to leave small things for her, things she hadn't asked for but found herself quietly grateful for. A patch of new fabric for the quilts she was making, fresh milk in the morning before dawn, a bundle of dried herbs he had gathered from the hills. Each gesture was small, but it spoke to something deeper than words. He was learning her, and in doing so, he was showing her the kindness that had eluded her for so long. The first snowfall came quietly, the ground turning white beneath the heavy sky. The world felt muffled, softened by the snow that covered the earth like a blanket. Maylin woke early that morning, the air inside her cabin cold and sharp against her skin. She stepped outside, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, and stood on the porch, watching the snowflakes drift down. Cole was already outside, moving through the snow with his usual purpose. The smoke from his chimney curled up into the sky, and the world felt still, as if it were holding its breath. Maylin watched him for a moment before turning to make her way toward the barn. As she approached, she saw him standing in the doorway, looking out at the snow-covered fields. His broad shoulders were hunched against the cold, but he didn't seem to mind it. She stopped a few paces away, unsure of what to say. "You should come inside," Cole said, his voice quieter than usual. "The storm's picking up." Mei Lin nodded, her eyes falling to the snow beneath her feet. "I will." In a moment. For a long moment they stood there, the silence between them stretching long. Mei Lin knew this was the quiet moment before the storm, the moment when something was about to change, but neither of them could name it. When Cole finally turned, heading inside, Mei Lin followed him, her steps steady. The warmth of the house greeted her as she stepped inside, the fire already crackling in the hearth. She didn't know what the future held, or what was waiting for her in the months to come, but she knew that, in this moment, she wasn't alone. The winter deepened slowly, each day an echo of the one before. The world outside the ranch seemed a distant place, swallowed up by snow and silence. The fire in the hearth crackled steadily, and the wind howled outside, but inside the cabin there was a warmth Mei Lin had never known before. Her hands, once trembling with fear, now moved with purpose. The meals she prepared for them both were simple, but she took pride in them, in the small acts of care that filled the space between them. Cole had started to spend more time indoors, his usual work outside slowed by the harsh winter. His presence, though as silent as ever, had become a constant in her life. In the mornings he would bring wood for the fire, sometimes quietly sitting by it to warm his hands. At night, they would share the simple meals Mei Lin had prepared, the silence between them comfortable now, as if they had found a rhythm that didn't need words. But something had changed. Mei Lin could feel it. It was the way he would look at her now, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than they used to. The way his hand would brush hers when he passed her a cup of tea, the small, almost imperceptible touch of his fingers. It was in the way he began to speak to her, more often now, as though the silence had softened enough to allow words to slip through. One evening, as the snow continued to fall heavily outside, Mei Lin was sitting by the fire, mending one of Cole's worn shirts. Her fingers worked methodically, each stitch a quiet reflection of the life she had begun to build here. She had taken to small acts of care, mending his clothes, organizing the small space she called home, and offering him the things she knew he needed, though he never asked for them. She was focused on the shirt when she heard his footsteps behind her. When she looked up, Cole was standing in the doorway, his broad frame filling the space. He didn't speak at first, just looked at her with that quiet intensity that had always made her heart skip. "You've been busy," he said, his voice low, the warmth of the fire casting flickering shadows across his face. Mei Lin nodded, not sure what to say. She was used to his silence, used to the way his presence filled the space between them, without the need for words. But tonight felt different. There was something in the way he was looking at her, something that made her heart beat faster. "You've made this place yours," he said, his voice softening. "It feels different now." She set the shirt down on the table and stood slowly, unsure of the sudden rush of emotions that filled her chest. She walked over to him, her footsteps quiet in the snow that had begun to pile up outside. "Thank you," she said simply. It was a word she had used before, but tonight it felt more meaningful. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him how much his quiet kindness had meant to her, how much his presence had changed her life, but the words wouldn't come. For a long moment they stood there, the fire crackling behind them, the snow falling softly outside. It was a moment of stillness, of waiting, and then, without a word, Cole stepped forward. His hand reached out, and for the first time, Mei Lin didn't pull away. His touch was gentle, like he was unsure of what to do, but it was enough. He cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her skin, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. "I never meant for you to feel like you owed me anything," he said, his voice low, rough with an emotion she hadn't expected. "But I know I haven't always made it easy." Mei Lin's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, the firelight dancing in his eyes. There was a rawness in his gaze, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen before, and it took her breath away. "You've given me more than I ever expected," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth, "more than I thought I could ever have." Cole's eyes softened, his hand still resting on her cheek. "I didn't win you, Mei Lin," he said quietly. "I was the one who lost." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment neither of them moved. Mei Lin's heart ached as she looked into his eyes, seeing the depth of the sorrow he had carried with him for so long. She had always seen him as the strong, silent man who had given her a chance when no one else would. But now she saw the scars he had hidden, the quiet grief that had shaped him. "I thought I'd never let anyone in again," Cole said, his voice barely a whisper. "But you've changed that." The vulnerability in his words made Mei Lin's chest tighten. She had never imagined that this man, who had seemed so unshakable, could carry such pain. And yet, standing there with her, sharing his grief, she knew that they had both been carrying something heavy. Her hand, almost of its own accord, reached up to cover his, resting there for a moment, grounding them both. "We both have our burdens," she said softly, "but we don't have to carry them alone." For the first time, she saw something in Cole's eyes that she hadn't seen before, a flicker of hope. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And in that moment, Mei Lin knew that she wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she was no longer alone. Cole leaned forward slowly, his movements deliberate, and kissed her forehead, a simple gesture that carried all the weight of everything they had silently shared. Mei Lin closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the moment wash over her. For once, there was no fear, no uncertainty, just the quiet, steady promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. As the night stretched on and the snow continued to fall, Mei Lin allowed herself to believe in the future for the first time in a long while. She didn't know what it would bring, but she knew she had found something worth holding on to. The days that followed were quiet, almost peaceful in their simplicity. Winter had fully settled in, blanketing the land in deep white snow, the cold air biting at anything that dared to stand still for too long. But inside the ranch house, a warmth had taken root, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. It was the warmth of two souls finally learning how to trust, how to care, how to be more than just survivors. Mei Lin had come to understand the quiet way Cole moved through the world. He worked with a silent focus, his hands always busy with something. But now his actions spoke louder than they ever had before. Every task, every small gesture was done with her in mind. He had become the still center of her life, a constant in the storm, and in return, Mei Lin had learned to take small risks, to let herself soften in the warmth of his company. Their connection, which had begun in silence, was now something more, something tender and real. Cole still spoke sparingly, but when he did, his words had meaning. And Mei Lin, once bound by fear, had learned to let herself be vulnerable. They didn't need grand gestures or declarations. It was in the small, everyday moments that their bond grew stronger. One evening, as the light from the fire danced across the room, Cole sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the stars above. Mei Lin watched him from the doorway, her heart full of a quiet tenderness she hadn't known was possible. He had built a life for himself here, on this land, alone for so long. And yet, in some small way, he had opened up to her. He had made room for her in that quiet world. She stepped outside, the cold air nipping at her skin, and walked slowly toward him. Her breath misted in the air as she stood beside him, her eyes following his gaze to the stars. It was a sight she had grown to appreciate, the endless sky, the vastness of the world stretching out before them. "You've always been a quiet man," Mei Lin said, her voice soft as she stood beside him. "But you've given me more than I ever expected." Quote. Cole turned his head to look at her, his eyes steady as always, but there was a warmth in them now, a flicker of something that had once been hidden. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was simple, but it spoke volumes. "I never meant to win you," he said quietly, his voice low, "but I think I found something worth fighting for." The words were a quiet confession, a truth that had taken him time to admit, not just to her, but to himself. Mei Lin's heart swelled as she turned to face him, her hand slipping into his. In that moment, she knew that their bond had grown into something unbreakable. Cole's fingers tightened gently around hers, and he led her to the small meadow beyond the house, the place where the wildflowers bloomed in the spring, where the wind whispered through the trees. They didn't speak as they walked, their silence comfortable now. The world was still, the only sound, the crunch of snow beneath their boots. When they reached the meadow, Cole stopped, his gaze turning toward the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight dipped below the snow-capped mountains. The sky was a canvas of deep reds and purples, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. It was a beautiful, quiet moment, and for the first time, Mei Lin felt as though she truly belonged here. "I'm not asking for anything," Cole said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. "But I want you to stay. With me. I want us to build something here, together." Mei Lin turned to him, her heart in her throat. She had spent so long running, so long hiding from the world, that she had forgotten what it felt like to truly be seen, to truly belong. But standing there, in the quiet meadow, with the weight of the snow around them, she knew that this was home. "I'm already here," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is my home." Cole's expression softened, the corners of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. He didn't need words. He had already made his promise through his actions, and Mei Lin, in turn, had made hers through her trust, her willingness to stay. As the snow continued to fall gently around them, Mei Lin reached out, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her fingers. For the first time, she felt the full weight of what they had built, their shared silence, their quiet connection, the life they had begun to create together. The future was uncertain, as it always was, but Mei Lin knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a family. Not because of some grand promise, but because they had built something real and true, a love that had bloomed quietly, without fanfare, and now, like the snow, it covered everything. Cole leaned down, his lips brushing the top of her head in a gesture that was simple but spoke of everything they had become. And as the first star appeared in the sky, Mei Lin closed her eyes, feeling the peace that had finally settled in her heart. The winds of change had come, but they no longer felt like a threat. They felt like a new beginning,